A wedding day. The moment every girl dreams of. For Evelyn Vance, it was supposed to be the beginning of her fairy tale, marrying the dashing billionaire Damian Blackwood. She was radiant, she was in love, and she was carrying his child. But in front of hundreds of their wealthiest friends and family, the fairy tale shattered. With one swing of his hand, her prince became a monster, and her dream became a public nightmare. What could a pregnant bride do at that moment? Nothing. But what her quiet, unassuming father did next. It didn't just get justice. It brought an entire empire to its knees and exposed a secret so dark the entire hall was left in stunned, horrified silence. This isn't a story about heartbreak. It's a story about the devastating power of a father's revenge. The air in the grand ballroom of the Astor Grand Hotel didn't just shimmer. It hummed with the palpable energy of old money and new power. Lilies and white roses imported from the Netherlands cascaded from every surface, their cloying sweetness mixing with the scent of expensive perfume and the faint, crisp aroma of chilled champagne. This was the wedding of the year, the union of Damian Blackwood, the 30-something wunderkind of private equity, and the ethereal Evelyn Vance. Evelyn stood in the bridal suite, a vision in a custom Vera Wang gown. The silk felt like a second skin, cool and heavy against her own. Her reflection showed a woman she barely recognized. Her light brown hair was swept into an intricate chignon, with delicate wisps framing a face made flawless by a celebrity makeup artist. But it was her eyes, a soft hazel, that held the truth. They were bright with a nervous excitement that bordered on anxiety. Her hand rested instinctively on the slight, barely there curve of her stomach. 4 months. 4 months carrying the heir to the Blackwood fortune. Her best friend and maid of honor, Chloe, adjusted a stray pearl pin. "You look breathtaking, Evelyn. Like stop the world on its axis breathtaking." Evelyn offered a weak smile. "I feel like I'm about to walk a tightrope over a canyon." "That's just normal wedding jitters," Chloe said, though her eyes held a flicker of something else, a concern she'd been nursing for months. "Just remember to breathe, and try not to trip. This dress probably costs more than my apartment building." The truth was, Evelyn's anxiety wasn't just about the wedding. It was about Damian. When they'd met a year ago at a charity gala, he had been everything she'd ever read about in novels. He was devastatingly handsome, with eyes the color of a stormy sea and a smile that could disarm world leaders. He'd pursued her with a relentless, all-consuming passion that had swept her off her feet. He'd showered her with gifts, whisked her away to Paris on a whim, and made her feel like the only woman in the world. But there was another side to Damian, a side that emerged when the doors were closed. It started small, a suggestion about what she should wear, a dismissive comment about her friends, especially Chloe, whom he deemed unambitious. He'd streamlined her life, convincing her to leave her job as a gallery assistant to focus on their future. He'd isolated her not with bars, but with diamonds and silk. He called it protection love. But sometimes, late at night, it felt like ownership. The pregnancy had intensified everything. He was ecstatic, but his control tightened. He monitored her diet, her schedule, even her phone calls. "It's for the baby, my love," he'd murmur, kissing her temple. "Our legacy must be protected. Evelyn, it's time." Her father, Arthur Vance, stood in the doorway. He was a man who seemed to take up less space than he should, of average height and build, with graying temples and a quiet demeanor. He looked utterly out of place amongst the titans of industry gathering below. A retired accountant from a mid-sized firm in Ohio, He was the picture of unassuming middle-class decency. He wore a simple, well-fitted tuxedo that still looked like a costume on him. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent behind his glasses, held a universe of love and a sliver of the same worry Chloe couldn't hide. "Thanks, Dad." She hugged him, finding a momentary anchor in his familiar, steady presence. "Are you happy, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for her. It was the question he'd asked several times over the past few months. "I am," she lied, or perhaps willed it to be the truth. "Damian is a lot. But he loves me. And the baby." Arthur just nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. He had never liked Damian. From their first meeting, Arthur's quiet observation had unnerved the billionaire. Damian had tried to impress him with talk of stock portfolios and acquisitions, but Arthur had simply asked him about his favorite book. Damian had laughed it off, but he couldn't answer. Arthur saw not a titan, but a hollow man. He'd warned Evelyn gently to be careful to not lose herself in the whirlwind. She had assured him she wouldn't. Now, standing here, Arthur Vance looked like a man holding a losing hand, waiting for the final card to be played. Downstairs, Damian Blackwood was adjusting his cufflinks. He was talking to his best man, Julian Croft, but his eyes were scanning the room, cataloguing every guest, every potential rival, every sycophant. His mother, Isabella Blackwood, a formidable woman, sculpted from ice and ambition, glided to his side. "Everything is perfect, Damian," she said, her voice a low purr. "The Carringtons are here. Senator Thompson just arrived. This isn't just a wedding. It's a coronation." "As it should be," Damian said, a smirk playing on his lips. "And the bride, on her way. Remember, darling," Isabella added, touching his arm, her manicured fingers like talons. "She is a beautiful little thing, but she is malleable. She is the vessel for the next Blackwood. Ensure she remembers her role." Damian's smirk tightened. "Don't worry, Mother. She knows exactly what she is. She's mine." As the grand doors to the ballroom opened and the first notes of the bridal march began to play, Evelyn took her father's arm. The sea of faces turned towards them, a blur of wealth and influence. At the end of the aisle, Damian was waiting, his handsome face lit with a triumphant smile. To the world, he was the prince welcoming his bride. But to Evelyn, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, the grand hall felt less like a church and more like a beautiful, inescapable cage. Walking down the aisle felt like floating through a dream. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were on her, their gazes a physical weight. The flash of a professional photographer's camera, the soft rustle of silk and chiffon from the pews, the soaring notes of the string quartet. It all merged into a sensory overload. Evelyn focused on one thing only: the man waiting for her under a breathtaking arch of woven branches and starlit orchids. Damian's eyes devoured her as she approached. He looked every bit the modern-day Adonis in his Tom Ford tuxedo. When she reached the altar, he took her hand. His grip was firm, possessive. He leaned in his lips, brushing her ear. "You are perfect, Mrs. Blackwood to be." He whispered the words, a possessive claim rather than a compliment. "I knew the world would be jealous." The ceremony, officiated by a retired judge who was a long-time family friend of the Blackwoods, was a masterclass in elegant pomp. The words washed over Evelyn in a haze. It was only when it came time for the vows that reality sliced through the fog. Damian went first. He had written his own, of course. He spoke without notes, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. "Evelyn." He began, his stormy eyes locked on hers. "Before you, my life was a series of transactions of acquisitions. I understood the value, but not the worth. I understood power, but not strength. You, my love, have taught me the difference. You are the single greatest merger of my life, the one asset I will protect above all others. I vow to build an empire for you, for our child, a fortress to keep you safe and cherished. I vow that you will never want for anything, and that the name Blackwood will be your shield and your crown. I am yours, irrevocably." A collective sigh rippled through the audience. It was poetic, powerful. But to Evelyn, and perhaps to her father, standing stoically in the front row, the words sounded cold. Transactions, acquisitions, asset, fortress. It wasn't the language of love. It was the language of a takeover. Now it was her turn. She had prepared vows as well, simple and heartfelt, filled with promises of shared laughter and mutual support. But as she opened her mouth, Damian subtly squeezed her hands. A signal. They had discussed this. He had suggested she use the vows his mother had helped draft. He'd said it was about presenting a united front. At the time, she'd acquiesced, wanting to avoid a fight. Now it felt like a gag. Her voice trembled slightly as she recited the polished, impersonal words. "Damian, I stand here today to join my life with yours. I vow to honor the legacy of the Blackwood name, to be a worthy partner in your endeavors, and to create a home that is a testament to our success. I will stand by you, support your vision, and dedicate myself to our family. I offer you my loyalty, my fidelity, and my heart today, and for all of our days." It was a speech fit for a corporate wife, not a soulmate. As she finished, she saw Chloe in the front row, her brow furrowed in confusion and disappointment. She saw her father, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness. She had just publicly sworn her fealty. The reception that followed was even more extravagant. A 10-foot-tall champagne fountain dominated the center of the room. A jazz band played softly as waiters in white gloves served canapes of caviar and truffle-infused delicacies. The mood was jubilant, but a strange tension coiled beneath the surface. Evelyn felt it every time Damian's hand found the small of her back, guiding her, steering her from one conversation with a banking CO to another with a tech mogul. He introduced her not as his wife, but as his prize. "This is my Evelyn," he'd say, a proud glint in his eye. "Isn't she stunning?" An hour into the reception, Evelyn felt a wave of nausea, a common symptom of her pregnancy that was amplified by the stress and the overwhelming scent of flowers. She excused herself, needing a moment of quiet. "I'll come with you," Damian said immediately, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "No, it's okay," she insisted, trying to sound breezy. "I just need some air. I'll be right back." His fingers tightened on her arm for a fraction of a second before he let go. "Don't be long. We have to cut the cake." Escaping the ballroom felt like breaking the surface of water after holding her breath for too long. She found a small, secluded balcony overlooking the city lights. The cool night air was balm. A moment later, a familiar voice said, hiding out. She turned to see Mark Renshaw, an old friend from her university art history program. He was a kind, gentle soul with a passion for impressionist painting. He worked as a curator at a small independent gallery, the kind of place Damian would scoff at. "Mark, "Oh my God, I didn't know you were here," Evelyn said, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "My +1 cancelled last minute, and a friend of a friend works for Blackwood Global. It's a small world," he said with a shrug. "You look beautiful, Evelyn. Truly, but are you okay?" The simple, honest question was almost her undoing. The dam of her composure began to crack. "It's just a lot," she admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "More than I expected." "I get it," he said, leaning against the railing beside her. He didn't pry, didn't ask about her billionaire husband. He just started talking about their favorite professor, a disastrous road trip they once took to see a Monet exhibit, and the simple happy days that now felt a lifetime away. They laughed, and for 5 minutes, Evelyn felt like herself again. She wasn't an asset or a vessel. She was just Evelyn. She didn't see Damian approach. He moved with the predator's silence. One moment she was laughing at a memory. The next a chilling voice cut through the air. "Having a nice chat." Evelyn spun around. Damian stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. His eyes weren't on her. They were locked on Mark, a look of such utter contempt that Mark physically recoiled. "Damian, this is Mark, an old friend from college," Evelyn said quickly, trying to diffuse the palpable tension. "I know who he is," Damian said, his voice dangerously low. He took a step forward, invading their space. "The little curator. Tell me, Mark, what's the market rate for a failing gallery these days? I might buy it and turn it into a parking garage." Mark paled. "We were just catching up." "You were," Damian snarled, "touching my wife." "I wasn't." "I saw you," Damian interrupted, stepping directly in front of Mark. "You were making her laugh. That's my job now." He turned his icy gaze on Evelyn. "Our guests are waiting. We have a schedule to keep. Or have you forgotten your duties already?" The venom in his voice was terrifying. This was the Damian she feared, the one whose temper could flash like lightning from a clear blue sky. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "Damian, you're hurting me," she whispered, her heart pounding. "Let's go," he ordered, pulling her back towards the ballroom, leaving a stunned and frightened Mark alone on the balcony. As they re-entered the dazzling light of the reception, Damian's face transformed. The rage vanished, replaced by his charming public smile. He was an actor, and this was his greatest performance. But Evelyn could still feel the phantom pain on her arm, and the cold dread coiling in her 4-month pregnant belly. The worst part of the night had not yet begun. The transition back into the ballroom was jarring. The moment they stepped through the doors, the buoyant energy of the party washed over them, a stark contrast to the venomous tension of the balcony. Damian's hand, which had been a vice on her arm, now rested gently on the small of her back, a gesture of loving possession for all to see. He leaned in his breath, warm against her ear, but his words were shards of ice. "Smile," he hissed, his voice inaudible to anyone else. "You look panicked. People will talk. Is that what you want on our wedding day? A scandal because you can't control yourself around your little art school boyfriend." Evelyn felt a chill snake down her spine. "He's just a friend, Damian. You're twisting this into something it's not." "What I'm doing," he whispered back, steering her toward the towering 11-tier wedding cake, "is protecting my investment. And right now, you're it. So play the part." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Investment. The word echoed the cold calculus of his vows. She felt dizzy, trapped under the weight of 1,000 pairs of eyes and the crushing reality of the man she had just married. They reached the cake. The photographer and videographer moved into position, their lenses like soulless eyes. The master of ceremonies, a jovial man named Bill, tapped a glass for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please, it is now time for the moment. We've all been waiting for the cutting of the cake by our handsome groom, Damian, and his beautiful bride, Evelyn." A polite ripple of applause went through the room. Damian was handed a silver cake knife with an ornate pearl-inlaid handle. He wrapped his hand around it and then placed his other hand over Evelyn's, guiding her to join him. His touch was cold. As they posed for the cameras, Damian's mother, Isabella, glided over. She smiled a brittle, perfect expression, but her eyes were flinty. "Damian, darling," that little scene on the balcony, was noticed by more than a few people. "What was that about?" "A minor issue, mother." "Handled," Damian replied through a clenched jaw, his smile never wavering for the cameras. Isabella's gaze shifted to Evelyn, and it was filled with pure disdain. "You need to learn your place, dear. You are a Blackwood now. Your past associations are irrelevant. They reflect poorly on us." The condescension, the possessiveness, the public humiliation, it all coalesced into a single defiant spark within Evelyn. She had been silent for too long, placating his moods, accepting his control as a twisted form of love. But the mention of her pregnancy, the life she was carrying, made her find a sliver of courage she didn't know she possessed. She pulled her hand from under Damian's. It was a small gesture, but in the hyper-focused spotlight of the moment, it was a seismic shift. Damian's smile faltered for a second. "What are you doing?" he murmured, his voice a low threat. "I just need a glass of water," she said. Her own voice barely a whisper, but it was steady. She turned to move away from the cake. "We're cutting the cake now, Evelyn," Damian said, his tone hardening, the command clear. "It can wait 30 seconds, she replied, her back to him. She took a step towards the nearest waiter. It was that single step of defiance that broke him. His control, always a fragile veneer over a core of incandescent rage, shattered completely. In his mind, she wasn't just walking away. She was disobeying him. She was embarrassing him in front of his mother, his colleagues, his entire world. He moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. He grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around to face him. His handsome face was contorted into a mask of pure fury. "You will do as you are told." He spat, his voice no longer a whisper. And then he did the unthinkable. With an open palm, Damian Blackwood slapped his pregnant wife across the face. The sound was not loud, but in the expectant hush of the room, it was like a gunshot, a sharp, ugly crack that sliced through the music, the chatter, and the laughter. It echoed in the sudden, absolute silence that fell over the grand ballroom. For a moment, time froze. 1,000 guests, 100 waiters, an entire orchestra all stood as if turned to stone. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. Forks hovered over plates. The only sound was the quiet, horrified gasp that Evelyn let out more from shock than from pain. The sting on her cheek bloomed into a hot, throbbing ache. But it was nothing compared to the agony in her heart. She stared at Damian, her husband of less than 3 hours, and saw a stranger. The charming prince was gone, replaced by a monster with rage in his eyes. The room began to spin, the faces of the guests warping into a gallery of disbelief and horror. She saw Chloe, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. She saw Isabella Blackwood, whose expression was not one of shock, but of cold, calculating annoyance at the public spectacle. And then she saw her father. Arthur Vance had been standing near the edge of the dance floor. He did not shout. He did not run. He simply moved. He walked past the frozen statues of New York's high society with a calm, deliberate pace. His face was a blank slate, utterly devoid of emotion, which was somehow more terrifying than any expression of rage could ever be. He reached the raised platform, where Evelyn stood, trembling, one hand cradling her cheek, the other protectively on her stomach. He didn't even look at Damian. His eyes were only for his daughter. He gently took her arm. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, his voice the same quiet, steady tone he'd used her entire life. "We're leaving." Damian finally seemed to snap out of his rage-fueled trance, replaced by a dawning sense of panic. This was a public relations nightmare. "Now wait a minute, Arthur," Damian started, forcing a laugh. "It was just a misunderstanding, a lover's quarrel. We're all a bit emotional today." Arthur Vance stopped. He slowly turned his head, and for the first time that night, he looked Damian Blackwood directly in the eye. The quiet accountant from Ohio seemed to grow 10 feet taller. The air around him crackled with a silent, lethal intensity. "You will not speak to me," Arthur said, his voice still quiet, yet it carried across the silent hall like a judge's gavel. "And you will never ever speak to my daughter again." He started to lead Evelyn away, but Damian, desperate to regain control, grabbed his shoulder. "This is my wedding. You're not taking my wife anywhere." Arthur stopped again. He slowly, deliberately removed Damian's hand from his shoulder, as if he were disposing of something unclean. He looked at the hand, then back at Damian's face. "Your wife," Arthur said, a humorless smile touching his lips. "She is my daughter, and you, son, have just made the biggest mistake of your life. You think this is your stage, your audience." He gestured to the stunned crowd. "You have no idea what's about to happen." He then turned to the master of ceremonies, who was frozen by the cake table. "Bill, isn't it? I believe you have a microphone. I'd like to borrow it. I have a wedding toast I'd like to make." The master of ceremonies. Bill, a man paid handsomely to be jovial and unflappable, looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a freight train. He stared at Arthur, then at the furious face of Damian Blackwood, then back to the quiet, unassuming man, whose request felt more like a command. With trembling hands, he unclipped the wireless microphone from his lapel and handed it to Arthur Vance. Damian stepped forward, his face a thundercloud. "Security, get this man out of here!" 2 large men in black suits started to move from the periphery of the room, but they stopped dead when Arthur spoke into the microphone. His voice, now amplified, was still calm, but it filled every corner of the vast ballroom with an unnerving authority. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Damian," Arthur said, his eyes locking onto the billionaires. "Because if your men lay a single hand on me, the email I have scheduled to be sent in exactly 10 minutes will go to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the top 5 editors at the Wall Street Journal. Your choice." A collective gasp went through the room. This was no longer just a domestic dispute. The mention of the SEC and federal prosecutors changed the very air they breathed. Damian froze his face, draining of color. The security guards looked at him, awaiting orders. But he was silent, paralyzed. Arthur turned his back on Damian, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He helped Evelyn, who was still in a state of shock, to a chair on the edge of the dance floor. Chloe rushed to her side, wrapping a protective arm around her. Arthur gave his daughter's shoulder a gentle squeeze, a silent promise, before he turned to face the audience of stunned elites. He stood in the center of the room, a simple man in a rented tuxedo, holding the attention of some of the most powerful people in the world. Good evening, everyone. He began, his tone conversational, as if he were about to start a quarterly budget meeting. My name is Arthur Vance. For most of you, I am a nobody, the quiet father of the bride, a retired accountant from Ohio. And for the most part, you are correct. I have spent the last 40 years of my life looking at numbers. Spreadsheets, balance sheets, income statements. It might sound boring to you. Most people's finances are. Predictable. Orderly. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room before it landed back on Damian. But Damian Blackwood's finances, they are anything but boring. They are a work of art. A complex, intricate, beautifully constructed fantasy. A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not a wedding toast. This was an execution. Isabella Blackwood stood up, her face a mask of cold fury. This is outrageous. He's spouting nonsense. Damian, do something. Damian took a hesitant step forward. He's delirious, grieving the loss of his daughter to a new family. It's understandable, but am I? Arthur interrupted, his voice cutting through Damian's feeble excuse. Let's talk about something specific. Let's talk about Project Nightingale. At the mention of those two words, at least a dozen people in the room visibly flinched. Julian Croft, the best man, looked as though he'd been punched in the gut. Damian's face went from pale to ghostly white. Arthur's voice was methodical, precise, and utterly damning. Project Nightingale, for those of you not on the Blackwood Global mailing list, was a revolutionary biotech venture that Blackwood Global acquired 2 years ago. It promised a groundbreaking Alzheimer's treatment. Damian hosted a special round of funding for it, bringing in over $200 million from many of you in this very room. He gestured vaguely with his free hand. The Carringtons, I believe you invested $10 million. Senator Thompson, your blind trust contributed $5. It was a sure thing, wasn't it? Backed by glowing lab results and projected FDA approval. He let the statement hang in the air before delivering the killing blow. The only problem is Project Nightingale never existed. The company Nightingale Biometrics was a shell corporation registered in Delaware. The lab results were fabricated by a disgraced researcher in Bolivia, and the $200 million. It wasn't invested in research. It was funneled through a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Panama, before being used to, among other things, artificially inflate Blackwood Global's fourth quarter earnings report, and of course to fund this very wedding. The silence in the room was now absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the silence of dawning financial ruin. You're lying, Damian finally roared, finding his voice. You have no proof. Proof, Arthur said, with that same chillingly calm smile. Damian, you seem to have a misconception about who I am. I told you I was an accountant. I suppose I omitted a few details. For the last 20 years of my career, I wasn't just any accountant. I was a forensic accountant. I worked for a very quiet, very discreet firm that was hired by governments and corporations to find things that people like you hide. They called me the Ghost because I could slip into a company's financials and find every skeleton, every ghost in the machine. I retired last year. He took a step closer to the stage. But when my daughter, my only child, told me she was marrying you, a man who seemed too polished, too perfect, I decided to come out of retirement for one last personal project. It's amazing what you can find when you know where to look. A sloppy wire transfer here, a falsified invoice there. You're brilliant at the big picture, Damian, the grand deception. But you're sloppy with the details, and the devil, as they say, is always in the details. Arthur raised his eyes to the large projection screens on either side of the ballroom, which were currently displaying a romantic photo montage of Evelyn and Damian. "And just in case my word isn't enough," Arthur said, pulling a small USB drive from his pocket, "I took the liberty of preparing a small presentation." He walked over to the AV technician, who was cowering behind his control board. "Son, plug this in for me. Would you display file Blackwood X?" The AV technician, a young man named Leo, who was being paid triple his usual rate for the high-profile gig, looked at Arthur, then at the apoplectic face of Damian Blackwood. For a moment, he was paralyzed by indecision. Damian was the client, the man who signed the checks, but the quiet man with the microphone held an aura of undeniable, terrifying authority. The threat of the SEC and federal prosecutors hung in the air like poison gas. Leo made a swift calculation of his future prospects and decided that siding with the billionaire, whose empire was actively imploding, was a poor career choice. With a shaky hand, he took the USB drive. "Which input, sir?" "The one that overrides the photo montage," Arthur said calmly. Damian lunged forward, trying to get to the tech booth. "Don't you dare, I'll ruin you. I'll have you blacklisted from every event in this city." But Julian Croft, the best man, stepped in his path. Julian's face was ashen, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disgust. "Don't, Damian," he said, his voice low. "It's over." "Traitor!" Damian snarled, shoving him aside. But it was too late. The romantic photos of Damian and Evelyn vanished from the massive screens. They were replaced by something far less romantic, a complex flowchart. At the top, in a bold red box, were the words, "Blackwood Global Enterprises." Branching down from it was a dizzying web of shell corporations, offshore holding companies, and numbered accounts. Names like Apex Holdings Limited, Cayman, Viridian Solutions S.A. Panama, and Azure Trust Belize filled the screen. Arrows color-coded and annotated showed the flow of money. It looked like the battle plan for a financial invasion. "This," Arthur's amplified voice explained as he used a laser pointer from his pocket to direct the audience's attention, "is the real Blackwood Global. Not the one you see in the glossy annual reports, but the one that exists in the shadows." He clicked a button on a small remote, and the slide changed. It was a copy of a bank statement from Credit Suisse for an account under the name of Nightingale Biometrics. It showed an initial deposit of $200 million, followed by a series of large, rapid withdrawals to other accounts. "Here is the money from Project Nightingale." Arthur narrated his tone as dry as if he were explaining amortization. "Note the dates. The funds were dispersed within 72 hours of the last investment. Hardly the timeline for legitimate research and development." Click. The next slide showed a forged purchase order for laboratory equipment from a German company that, as a small annotation pointed out, had gone bankrupt 3 years prior. Click. An email chain between Damian and a man named Sergei Volkov, a known money launderer based in Cyprus. The subject line read "consulting fees." The guests were no longer just watching. They were captivated, horrified. Many were pulling out their phones not to record the drama, but to frantically text their own financial advisors. The air was thick with the smell of panic and betrayal. Damian was screaming now, a desperate, cornered animal. "It's fake. It's all fabricated. He's a bitter old man trying to destroy me." "Am I?" Arthur said, his voice unwavering. He advanced to the next slide. It was a satellite image of a lavish, half-built mansion on a private island in the Caribbean. "This is your contingency plan, isn't it, Damian? Your non-extradition paradise purchased under the name of a trust controlled by..." "Oh, this is interesting," He zoomed in on the document. The trustee's name was listed clearly, Isabella Blackwood. A collective gasp swept the room. Isabella, who had been watching with icy composure, finally broke. Her face contorted in a snarl of pure fury. "How dare you, you insignificant little man?" "I'm just an accountant, Mrs. Blackwood," Arthur said, without turning to look at her. "But I'm a very, very thorough one. You co-signed the transfer for the island property 2 weeks ago. I imagine you were planning a family vacation." He saved the most personal, most devastating blow for last. He clicked one final time. The screen showed a life insurance policy. It was for $25 million. The insured was Evelyn Vance. The beneficiary was Damian Blackwood. The policy was taken out the day after she had confirmed her pregnancy, and it contained a very specific clause. "This," Arthur said, his voice dropping, the calm finally cracking, to reveal the cold, hard rage beneath, "is a life insurance policy Damian took out on my daughter. Standard practice for some high net worth individuals, but this one has a rather peculiar rider. It pays out double in the event of an accidental death. It's amazing the kind of risks a pregnancy can introduce, isn't it? A fall down the stairs, a tragic car accident. So many possibilities." The implication was monstrous, a truly evil insinuation that hung in the silent room. Was the slap just a loss of temper, or the first crack in a much darker, more sinister plan? No one could be sure, but the seed of that horrific thought had been planted. Evelyn stared at the screen, her blood running cold. She thought of his obsessive control, his monitoring of her every move, his insistence that only his driver take her anywhere. She had thought it was overbearing love. Now she saw it in a horrifying new light. As if on cue, the grand doors of the ballroom burst open. But it wasn't more guests arriving. It was 4 stern-faced individuals in dark suits, 2 men and 2 women. They moved with the quiet efficiency of federal agents. One of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes, held up her badge. "Damian Blackwood, Isabella Blackwood. We're with the FBI. You need to come with us." The room erupted into chaos. The carefully constructed world of Damian Blackwood had not just been shaken. It had been systematically dismantled and utterly annihilated in the space of 15 minutes by a quiet accountant from Ohio. Arthur Vance lowered the microphone. His work was done. The ledger was balanced. The arrival of the FBI was like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. The quiet horror of the guests erupted into a cacophony of frantic whispers, clicking phones, and the scraping of chairs as people scrambled to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Blackwood family. Reporters who had been cordoned off outside must have gotten a tip because a flurry of flashes began to strobe through the ballroom's glass doors. Damian stood frozen, his face a grotesque canvas of disbelief, rage, and dawning terror. His empire, his reputation, his very identity had been publicly executed. He looked at the agents, then at the jeering, fearful faces of his guests, his former friends and investors, and finally his wild eyes landed on Evelyn. "You!" he shrieked, his voice raw and broken. "You did this! You and your pathetic old man!" He lunged toward her, a final desperate act of violence, but he never made it. The 2 male FBI agents intercepted him with professional ease, pinning his arms behind his back. The custom Tom Ford tuxedo ripped at the shoulder seam. "You're making it worse for yourself, Mr. Blackwood," one of the agents said calmly. Isabella Blackwood, however, did not scream or lunge. She was made of sterner, colder stuff. As the female agents approached her, she drew herself up to her full height, her expression one of pure aristocratic contempt. "Take your hands off me," she hissed. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Yes, ma'am," the lead agent replied, her voice flat and unimpressed. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges including conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." The sight of the formidable Isabella Blackwood being read her rights and handcuffed was for many in the room even more shocking than Damian's arrest. The matriarch, the queen bee of New York society, was being treated like a common criminal. The illusion of their untouchability was shattered forever. As the agents led the Blackwoods away, Damian continued to scream threats and curses. His carefully crafted persona stripped away to reveal the spoiled, vicious child beneath. In the midst of the chaos, Arthur Vance walked back to his daughter. He knelt before her, his hands gently taking hers. Her face was pale, stained with tears, her eyes wide with the trauma of the past hour. "It's over, Evelyn," he said softly. "It's all over. You're safe now." Chloe was on her other side, holding her, murmuring words of comfort. "He can't hurt you anymore. He's gone." Evelyn looked from her father's face to the chaotic scene of the crumbling party, then to the exit through which her husband, her abuser, had just been dragged away. A single heavy tear rolled down her cheek, a tear not of sadness, but of profound, gut-wrenching relief. It was the release of a year's worth of tension of fear she hadn't even let herself acknowledge. "How?" she whispered to her father. "How did you know all of this?" "I'll tell you everything," he promised, "but not here." He stood up and helped her to her feet. The magnificent Vera Wang gown, the symbol of her entry into the Blackwood dynasty, now felt like a costume from a horror movie. As they began to walk toward the exit, a path seemed to clear for them. The remaining guests parted like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of pity, awe, and fear. They were looking at Arthur Vance, not as the bride's unassuming father, but as a giant slayer. As they passed the head table, Julian Croft, the best man, stepped forward. His face was etched with shame. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I knew about some of it. The Nightingale project. I suspected it was a sham. I didn't say anything. I'm so sorry, Evelyn." Arthur looked at him, his gaze analytical, not accusatory. "Some men are defined by their actions, Mr. Croft. Others by their inaction. You'll have to live with your choice." The U.S. Attorney's Office will likely be in touch to see which man you want to be from now on. The words hung in the air, both a condemnation and a potential lifeline. Julian nodded, swallowing hard, and stepped back, with Chloe on one side and her father on the other. Evelyn walked out of the ballroom. She didn't look back at the 11-tier cake that would never be cut at the champagne fountain that had stopped flowing at the wilting Dutch roses, or at the ruins of her short, disastrous marriage. She walked out of the Astor Grand Hotel, leaving the gilded cage behind. The cool night air hit her face, and for the first time in a very long time she felt like she could breathe again. The future was uncertain and terrifying. She was pregnant, alone, and at the center of a massive scandal. But she was also free, and she was holding the hand of the man who had torn down an empire to give her that freedom. The father who had seen the monster behind the prince's smile and had quietly, methodically sharpened the blade of justice, waiting for the moment to strike. 2 months later, the autumn chill had settled over the city, stripping the leaves from the trees in Central Park. The scandal, dubbed the Blackwood implosion by the press, was still front-page news. Damian and Isabella Blackwood were out on a multi-million-dollar bail, their assets frozen, facing a mountain of federal charges. Their trial was set to be the legal spectacle of the decade. Dozens of investors had lost fortunes, and the domino effect had toppled two smaller hedge funds. Julian Croft had become the prosecution's star witness, his testimony securing him a plea deal and cementing the case against his former best friend. Evelyn was living in a quiet, sunlit apartment on the Upper West Side, a place her father had rented for her. It was modest compared to Damian's penthouse, but it felt more like a home than that sterile glass tower ever had. The Vera Wang dress was gone, donated anonymously to a charity. Her life was slowly being rebuilt, not on a foundation of wealth and power, but on one of safety and truth. She was sitting on a comfortable sofa, a mug of herbal tea, warming her hands, watching the snow-dusted branches outside her window. Her baby bump was more pronounced now, a firm, reassuring presence. She was going to be a mother. The thought no longer terrified her. It filled her with a quiet strength. Arthur came in from the kitchen, handing her a plate of sliced apples. He had been staying with her since the wedding, a silent, steady guardian. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, sitting in the armchair opposite her. "Okay," she said, and for the first time it felt true. "I was just thinking, you never really told me how you did it. I mean, I know what you did, but how did you even know where to start looking?" Arthur sighed, settling back into his chair. "I told you, Evelyn. From the first time I met him, something felt wrong. People like Damian Blackwood, they don't build empires that quickly without cutting corners. They see rules not as boundaries, but as obstacles to be navigated or demolished. So I started looking. But how you are retired. Retirement gives a man a lot of free time," he said with a small smile. "I still have contacts, old friends at the IRS, a former colleague who now designs security software for major banks. I started with public records, property deeds, SEC filings. That's where I first saw the shell corporations. It was amateur stuff, really, but hidden behind a wall of legitimate-looking businesses. He was arrogant. He never thought anyone would look closely." He leaned forward, his expression serious. The key was Project Nightingale. When he announced it, the science sounded too good to be true. "I paid an independent biochemist, an old expert witness I used to work with, to review the prospectus. He said the data was impossible, that the results were statistically perfect, in a way that real-world science never is. That's when I knew it was a fraud. From there, it was just a matter of following the money." "You did all that for me?" Evelyn asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Before the wedding?" "I did it because you are my daughter," he said simply. "I hoped I was wrong. I prayed I was just a paranoid old man who didn't think anyone was good enough for his little girl. I compiled everything into a file, a sort of insurance policy. I never planned to use it. I thought maybe he'll be a good husband, a good father. Maybe his love for you will make him a better man." His eyes darkened with the memory of that night. "But when he put his hand on you, when I saw the look in his eyes on that balcony, I knew. And when he slapped you, he didn't just hurt you, Evelyn. He signed his own death warrant. He gave me the reason I needed to burn his whole world to the ground." "The FBI, Dad. How did you get them there so fast?" "An old friend from the U.S. Attorney's Office. I had sent him the preliminary file a week before the wedding under a strict embargo. I told him I had a source who would provide definitive, irrefutable proof of a massive Ponzi scheme at a specific time and place. I gave him the date and location of the wedding, I told him to have a team ready. He trusted me." Evelyn shook her head in awe. Her quiet, unassuming father was a strategic genius, a warrior who fought with spreadsheets and bank codes instead of swords. He had planned for every contingency. "The life insurance policy," she whispered. "Did you really think he would?" Arthur's face was grim. "I think a man who can hit his pregnant wife in front of 1,000 people is capable of anything when his back is against the wall. I wasn't willing to find out." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what could have been hanging between them. Evelyn reached out and took her father's hand. "He's going to prison for a very long time," Arthur said. "He'll try to fight it, but the evidence is overwhelming. The Blackwood name will be nothing but a cautionary tale. You and this baby," he said, patting her hand. "You get to start fresh, with the Vance name. A name that may not be powerful or famous, but it's honest. It's built on something real." Looking at her father, at his kind, intelligent eyes, Evelyn understood. She had been seduced by a fantasy, a fairy tale built on lies. But she had been saved by a real, unconditional love. The love of a father who would go to war for his daughter. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the gentle flutter of life within. This child would not be a Blackwood heir. They would be Vance, and they would be raised knowing the story of their grandfather, the quiet accountant who proved that the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who reads the fine print. And so Evelyn's story wasn't an ending, but a new beginning, forged from the ashes of a lie. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't found in billionaires' penthouses or lavish weddings, but in the unwavering love of family and the courage to stand up to abuse, no matter how powerful the abuser seems. The world of Damian Blackwood was built on sand, and a single righteous storm washed it all away. What do you think about Arthur's meticulously planned revenge? Was it pure genius, or did he go too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Stories like this deserve to be told. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible real-life drama. Thank you for listening.